Hi, it's Saturday, August 3rd. We're tracking Tropical Depression 4, currently centered north of western Cuba, classified by the National Hurricane Center yesterday evening as it tracked just south of Cuba, now crossing the island, and the broad center of circulation is emerging over the southeastern Gulf of Mexico. The system is expected to move generally to the north from here, west of the Florida Peninsula, and we have seen a bit of a track shift to the left over the last 24 hours that we will talk about here in just a second. First, the zoomed in satellite view showing the structure of TD4. This remains fairly broad at the moment, but now a closed circulation, unlike the wave structure that we had been seeing up to this point. But there is a closed circuit of flow with the strongest winds out of the southeast currently moving into the Florida Keys. We could see winds of 25 to 35 miles per hour there pretty easily in this belt. And then you see lighter flow out of the north and the northwest, looping around the western tip of Cuba and then closing the circuit off here. So this is not yet super compact, and we don't have an inner core developing as of yet. However, within this broader pocket, we do have a vorticity maximum right in here, which is likely to become the anchor for the system's core over the coming 24 hours. There has been some elongation of the system towards the south, so there remains a little bit of an extension down here south of Cuba, and this vorticity maximum is kind of embedded within the northern side of that. This will become important short term because, as we talked about yesterday, the short term track of the storm is governed by whether or not it consolidates more towards the north or the south. Models got it a little bit wrong, and this ended up coming a little bit farther south of Cuba than expected, and it now is ending up in a general location where models did forecast it to be, but just slightly to the southwest. Some models yesterday had it more up here, and we're seeing it just a little bit more to the southwest. Whether or not the track shifts a little bit farther to the left will depend on how far this swings over in response to the trough extension to the south. Since this vorticity maximum is within the northern side, it may get rotated towards the west a little bit by the extra circulation sitting south of Cuba. And we can see that models are still piecing this together. If we look at the observed wind field from the ASCAP pass at about 11:30 a.m. Eastern time this morning, showing the strong wind belt on the eastern side, and you can see the wrapping around of weaker wind out of the north and northwest on the western side, with the vorticity maximum sitting north of Cuba right there. If we compare to what the 11 a.m. Eastern time forecasted wind field was from the GFS, everything on the eastern side is essentially as expected with the little vorticity maximum right there, but it fails to show a stronger western side with wrapping flow around western Cuba and south of the Isle of Youth here, basically showing that it is still a little too weak with the southern side of the circulation. Same with the European model, showing almost an open trough kind of structure in here instead of that wrapping northwest flow that we can clearly see in observations right here. All this to say that, again, if there's just a little bit more rotation here than expected, that could yank this over just a little further before it's released toward the north, and that will govern some of the little details about where this ends up making landfall along the Florida coastline. That said, we have already seen a substantial nudge to the left in the forecast track since yesterday, now that models are starting to see where TD4 is setting up shop. And on the GFS, you'll see here on the mid-level moisture plot, the black contours show you where the surface center is on the model going into Saturday night tonight, and then this will continue northward. Now, yesterday, this went right into the central Florida coastline and then into Cedar Key, but we've continued to see this walking to the left here because the launching point west of Key West has been shifting farther west and out over the open Gulf of Mexico. So now the track on the model is more into Appalachia Bay, and for that reason, we now have a little bit more time for the storm to track over water, and therefore some of these model runs are coming in a little bit stronger because of that extra time. And the concern here now is that this is a storm surge prone area, so a little bit stronger storm with a track more into Appalachia Bay means coastal flooding becoming a heightened concern with this particular storm. Now, you notice on the GFS there is a symmetric moisture core here, and this is kind of the bull case model scenario here, where the inner core develops, you start to get a formative eye, and a storm that is approaching hurricane strength and not fully disrupted by the wind shear that will exist out of the west. If we look at the upper level flow here, in general, as the storm makes landfall, in Florida, there is going to be this westerly flow aloft, kind of hitting it from the left side around this upper level ridge, which will be centered to the storm's south by the time it moves into the southeastern U.S. And so some moderate shear, 15 to 20 knots, will be impacting the storm. That is not enough to prevent strengthening, but it could present challenges to the formation of a symmetric inner core. And the details of that are often hard to predict with precision. So there is, of course, as usual, a range of outcomes. Get used to that. And as this comes ashore, we'll see likely intensification, but how much uncertain. So that could put it within the moderate to strong tropical storm to category 1 hurricane range is kind of where the expectation lies right now. If we look at the 500 millibar chart, the track for this, as we've been talking about, is governed by this trough over the Appalachians, which is currently there now and is about to pull out towards the northeast. So you'll see TD4 come north as this trough begins to evacuate, and you'll see this ridge over the Great Plains start to nose farther east. So around the time of landfall, which would be overnight Sunday or Monday morning based on current projections, you see this ridge nosing in, and this starts to block the motion of the storm. There is now southwesterly flow here across Florida trying to guide it northeastward, but now there's a compensating steering flow out of the northeast around this ridge, and they're fighting each other. So steering currents dramatically slow down, and so does the storm. And so as it comes ashore, models now start to spread out a lot on what happens from here. On this particular model run, the storm moves very slowly towards the southeastern coast of Georgia and South Carolina, making very slow progress, eventually gets back out over water and then re-strengthens slightly before moving back inland as this ridge over the western Atlantic starts to nose in from the east. That is similar to the National Hurricane Center official forecast, but it's important to note this is not the only outcome, and we have yet to converge on a high certainty forecast here. We're getting closer to knowing the landfall area in Appalachia Bay, but after that, the storm could simply go due north and kind of stall out inland. It could also drift eastward and get back out over water, and those two things are very different in terms of whether this re-intensifies before impacting the Carolinas more, or if it just stays inland and there's an inland flooding threat for Georgia, Alabama, and northern Florida. We've even seen some model runs move inland and then come back out over water for a time because this ridge is strong for a little while, and so if the storm is inland but a little bit farther west, it could feel this northerly flow and then approach the coast again. So there's still a range of meandering possibilities for the track of TD4 once it moves inland, and therefore the impacts to the coastal areas of the southeastern U.S. and the inland areas of the southeastern U.S. still a little fuzzy. But this is the NHC official forecast from this morning, showing the track shifted a little bit to the left. They were into Cedar Key at the time of the last video about 18 hours ago, and there's now a hurricane watch extending from Apalachicola to the area around Cedar Key, and this is reflecting the possibility that this could strengthen, getting up close to that hurricane threshold. The official forecast keeps this a tropical storm with max winds of 70 miles per hour, and that's probably a good median projection based on the storm structure right now. Still broad, so it'll take a little time to come together. We don't have an inner core yet, so this is not rapidly intensifying immediately coming off Cuba, but it could be organized enough by this point that, yeah, there is a risk here of this being a hurricane. But either way, expect strong winds all along the western Florida Peninsula coastline, where we have tropical storm warnings all the way down to the Keys, and for the dry Tortugas, a watch for the western Florida Keys there. And then expect rain all along the Florida Peninsula and then inland over Georgia, South Carolina, especially during the first few days here, and storm surge as this pushes water up along a pretty vulnerable piece of coastline, Appalachia Bay, known for easily flooding along the coastline. And so a track up here near or west of Alligator Point perhaps would push a fair bit of water, even if it's just a tropical storm with 60, 70 mile per hour winds, or a weak category 1 hurricane with 70 to 80 mile per hour winds. Expect some flooding here, both coastal and potentially inland. Here's the peak surge currently forecast from the National Hurricane Center. Water level rises of several feet, up to 4 feet along most of the western and northern Florida Peninsula, and then up to Indian Pass here near Apalachicola. These values here, they could still go up. Keep in mind that the official forecast track is a little east of Alligator Point. If it ends up shifting west, then these values could increase further, so keep that in mind. Right now, a maximum of 3 to 5 feet along the Nature Coast is expected. And then flash flooding potential, we are now upgraded to moderate risk across coastal northern Florida, Jacksonville, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina. That region there expected to have the greatest flooding risk. But again, this track after landfall still has some significant fuzziness to it. So depending on where the storm stalls out inland, if it stays farther west, for example, over inland Georgia, expect the possibility that flooding risk goes up here farther or further than it currently is. If the storm does indeed drift out back over water for a brief time, as the NHC forecast shows, then this makes perfect sense. But remember, there is a possibility that the location is a little different in days 3 to 5 as we head into the middle part of next week. So heads up in this whole area from northern Florida through the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama. Just keep an eye out here in case the risk goes up for you over the next couple of days. This is the wind probability plot from the NHC showing the chances of tropical storm force winds of 40 miles per hour or greater, along with the time of likely arrival. So you see that Sunday evening is kind of where dangerous winds are first approaching the coast, maximum probability along the forecast track. And you can see in general, if you're inland, this is not a major hurricane coming ashore, so unlikely to get huge wind inland, but certainly along coastal areas, elevated risk of tropical storm force winds and inland issues with trees and power outages due to the occasional gust. Certainly a possibility here, but it is likely that water hazards will be the primary concern, especially inland from the coast where heavy rain is likely to be dropped for a few days in a row here. Given this slow forward motion, you can see from Sunday night to Thursday morning, it's still in the southeastern U.S. It is not going anywhere fast, and that's unfortunately going to cause some heavy rain for some folks. That's about it for this video. We'll continue to track TD4 as it moves up through the Gulf of Mexico. Be prepared just in case there are risks to your area. Stay tuned to your local National Weather Service office and the National Hurricane Center at hurricanes.gov for the latest information. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.